Example 3, we're still trying to solve. So we know we're trying to isolate the variable. We're isolating this variable. We're peeling the onion. We're going to have to take a cosine of both sides, basically, to isolate x. So that's what we'll do. We'll take cosine of both sides. But if you notice, inverse sine of 1/2, that's going to be a value. There's all numbers there, and so we could evaluate that or simplify that. Inverse sine of 1/2. Anybody know what that is? Inverse sine is defined from negative pi over 2 to positive pi over 2. That is in quadrant 1 and quadrant 2. What'd you say?
Negative pi over 6.
There's no negative in the problem. It's not negative 1/2, it's positive 1/2. And when it's a positive value like this, we don't even really have to think. It's just pi over 6. Okay? We don't have to think about reference angles or anything that much. We just know it's positive. It's just going to be whatever that reference angle is, pi over 6. So inverse cosine of x equals pi over 6. And so if I'm trying to solve, I'm trying to isolate, I'm going to do a cosine on both sides to knock out that inverse cosine. I would have x equals whatever cosine pi over 6 is.
Square root of 3 over 2.
Square root of 3 over 15. That's right. X equals square root of 3 over 2. Okay, so I want to show you another example that's a little bit more complicated than this, just to try and set up example 4. So copy that down real quick. I've got inverse sine of x minus inverse cosine of negative square root of 3 over 2 equals negative pi. Okay. If we're trying to solve this, we know we're trying to isolate this variable. That's the only one. But what I would do first is I would evaluate this part. Okay. Let's evaluate that. That's all numbers, so we should be able to simplify that a little bit. Inverse cosine of negative square root of 3 over 2. So you're looking at your chart, and somebody says negative pi over 3. But remember, okay? Remember, for cosine, or inverse cosine, is defined from 0 to pi. And so when you look at that range, you should notice that we're not allowed to have a negative answer.
Pi over 6.
Pi over 6? Okay. It's definitely not negative, though. Okay? It's pi over 6 where inverse cosine is negative. And if you think about it, if we're defining from 0 to pi, we're talking about quadrants 1 and 2 only. And so quadrant 2 is where we would be negative. Inverse cosine can be negative in quadrant 2. And so the way you translate that is this is a pi over 6 reference angle in the second quadrant. Don't say negative pi over 6 because we're not allowed to have a negative value there. So pi over 6 in the second quadrant, we call this 6 pi over 6. So that means that this value must be 5 pi over 6. So let's just bring down the rest of the equation. Inverse sine of x minus that 5 pi over 6 that we just found the value of equals negative pi. So, I'm going to have to do a sine of both sides, but we better add that 5 pi over 6 over first. Okay? Let's add 5 pi over 6 to both sides. So inverse sine of x equals what we would get when we add those. Well, let's get a common denominator. Negative pi would be the same thing as negative 6 pi over 6. When we add that 5 pi over 6, that's going to be negative pi over 6. Inverse sine of x equals negative pi over 6. We're still peeling the onion, right? We're still trying to isolate x. And so isolate x here, we're going to take sine both sides. That means x equals sine negative pi over 6. Now, there are a couple of ways to think about this problem. We've done this before. It's been a while. We've done this before. I think the best way of thinking about it is to remember one of your negative angle identities. since sine is an odd function, basically we can pull that negative out first. And so I think the best way of looking at this is to understand that this is going to be the opposite of sine pi over 6. So all I have to do is look at sine pi over 6 and throw a negative in front of it. That's what we've got. Sine pi over 6, 1/2. I'm going to have negative 1/2. X equals negative 1/2. Of course, we could always check our answer by plugging it in. The other way, I mentioned there were a couple of ways of thinking about it. The other way, I guess, I would look at this. Maybe you're like, well, negative pi over 6 is going to be down there if I go around backwards. And so we know that's in the fourth quadrant, making this value negative. And so you can just look at sine pi over 6 and understand the fourth quadrant is going to be negative. So sine pi over 6 in the fourth quadrant is going to be negative 1/2. Same thing.